Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we might now begin the sixth session on the Immigration Conference, Immigration Recasting the Debate. For people who are new, I'm David Coates. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference. I'd like to welcome you to this session. I'm sure people realize this is a magic moment in what is turning out to be a very magic conference. We are uniquely fortunate to have with us and be able to listen directly to three leading figures from the three leading think tanks currently debating immigration reform in Washington. Our three speakers this morning in this session will be Robert Rector, the Senior Research Fellow for Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation, Daniel Griswold, who's the Director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Ross Eisenbrey, who's the Policy Director and Vice President of the Economic Policy Institute. Because time is short and very precious, I'm not going to give each of our speakers a very full introduction. Their biographies are available in the program. What instead we've decided to do is to take three 20 to 25 minute presentations and then leave time for questions and discussion from the floor. Just before we begin that process, let me just say two things, if I may, very briefly. The first is that position papers from each of our speakers are available free for collection from the bookstall in the lobby. When they are, the supply has run out, if anybody misses one, simply email me and we will ensure that you receive one. The second, another thing I wanted to say before we begin is that I anticipate that this is going to be a session in which people hear very controversial proposals, that some of which at least take them well outside their comfort zone. So it's particularly important, is it not, that we all listen very carefully and that we extend appropriate courtesies to each speaker in turn, particularly that speaker with whom we particularly disagree. And I look forward to hearing the presentations, I'm sure you do, and then to have the question and answer session. And first I would ask Robert Rector to begin for it. Thank you.
I go up here?
Yeah. Actually here, I think, Robert.
Here?
Say, yes, it will work.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you're wired.
All right. I'm going to talk about basically three things here today. The first is the sort of general principles that should be established for immigration policy into the U.S. Then I'm going to talk about the fiscal costs of immigration, that is the cost or benefits to the taxpayer. And then I'm going to talk about specific policy proposals that I believe should be enacted into legislation to adhere to the general principles in the immediate future. So let me begin by saying that I think there are 5 rules that should govern immigration policy into the United States, 5 general principles. And the first principle is the rule of law. The question in the determination of who enters the United States, who resides into the United States, who accesses government welfare, who becomes a citizen and votes in our elections and thereby determines the future of the United States, is a question that should be determined by U.S. citizens. It should not be determined unilaterally by foreigners from abroad. But in the United States today, as this principle is being violated in the sense that the determination of who enters and resides in the United States is largely determined unilaterally by people who violate our laws, and then the United States responds to that by periodically granting these individuals citizenship and thereby full rights to determine the political and economic future of the United States. That's a core violation of the sovereignty of the United States. So the first thing is that you as U.S. citizens should determine who does and who does not reside in the U.S. and who does and does not become a U.S. citizen. The second principle is that immigration should be economically beneficial to Americans, or at least it should not be economically harmful to Americans, and in particular should not be harmful to the least skilled and least advantaged Americans. Now that sounds sort of obvious, but what I mean by that is not merely that when we hear about immigration, we often say, well, immigration makes the economy larger. That isn't really the way we should decide this. The question should be, does immigration, obviously immigration makes the economy larger because anytime you add labor into an economy, you end up with a bigger GDP. But the real issue is, does immigration make the post-tax incomes of the average American better off? In other words, one way to think about this might be to think about a factory in which there are 10 people working and they're each making $30,000 a year. And if you added an 11th worker, you would find, wow, the output in the factory just went up 10%. Well, we have a bigger GDP, which is often the way this is debated in Congress. And clearly the output of the factory has gone up. But the question that's relative to the workers in that factory, the 10 original workers who are our native citizens, is what happened to my wages? Did my wages go up or down? Did my standard of living go up or down as a result of the fact that we added the additional worker? And very often that's not the consideration that's being made. Finally, third, we want immigration policy that is a net fiscal positive for the U.S. taxpayer. That is, immigration should not impose additional costs on the U.S. taxpayer. If you went across the globe, I think you would find probably 2 billion people that would like to come and live in the United States. And so the United States can be very selective about who it admits to this country. And one of the principles that we should follow is that people that come to this country should not impose an additional net burden on the taxpayers of the U.S. In fact, they should be what I call net fiscal contributors. They should be able to have enough skills to pay more in taxes than they take out in benefits. And that largely is not the case now, and the situation is getting worse as we move forward year by year. Third, immigration policy has to respect the core political culture of the United States. A simple fact of reality is that when immigrants, particularly immigrants, come in very large numbers, they alter and adjust. They do assimilate eventually, but they themselves also alter the culture of the society. And one of the questions I like to ask is, why do people want to come and live in the United States? Is it because we have a balmy climate? Is it because we're just nice people? People want to come and live in the United States because the United States generates a unique level of prosperity in comparison to most other nations in the world. And then you want to ask the question, well, why is that? Why is that there's no net migration, or there's very little net migration into Mexico? Why is it that Americans don't want to go to Mexico? And so forth. And the reality is that you can see that the prosperity of the United States is rooted in the underlying, often implicit, political culture of the United States. Respect for the rule of law, respect for limited government, respect for property, respect for the marketplace, ideas of personal responsibility, ideas that government is not to be used for personal gain. Now, when you look out across the cultures of the world, you find that those cultural traits are actually relatively rare, and that those societies which have them will tend to prosper, and other societies that don't will not prosper and will want to migrate into those societies that have these more successful political cultures. But we need to be very careful that you don't allow immigration to effectively kill the goose that lays the golden egg. If you have too much immigration too quickly, you will threaten those very underlying political cultural traditions that in fact generate the prosperity that brings immigrants to our shores. It doesn't mean that immigrants never assimilate. Most of us are the descendants of immigrants, but that there is a balance between the rate of inflow and the degree of assimilation, and if that rate of inflow is too rapid, it can threaten this very core political culture that generates the prosperity that brings the immigrants to the U.S. in the first place. And fifth and finally, immigration should not be used to tip the political balance in the United States. The reality is that immigrants tend to vote to the left, low-skill immigrants tend to vote more to the left, And it's quite clear that some people in Washington want very high levels of immigration because they essentially want a new electorate. They want to bring in additional voters to alter the political balance in one direction or another. One person who understands this very well is Senator Ted Kennedy, and he's very, very clear in what he's trying to accomplish there. That seems to me to be an invalid use of immigration to alter political structure in the U.S., and we should avoid that. One of the first things that we need to recognize is that immigration has altered in the last 20 years or so. That historically in the U.S., at least through the 20th century and most of the time through the 19th century, the immigrants coming into the U.S. were not lower skilled than native workers here. In fact, through most of the 20th century, they were actually somewhat better skilled than native workers. And as a consequence of that, they had higher wages and actually paid more in taxes, there we go, than did the average native-born worker. And the reality is that that has changed. And if we looked at immigrants today, we find that among illegal immigrants, close to half of them are high school dropouts. Among legal immigrants, about a quarter are high school dropouts, compared to only about 9% among native-born population. Now that is coupled with the fact that in the last, throughout the 20th century, we have generated within the government a massive transfer system in which say the top 1/3 of the population is massively taxed to provide subsidized benefits and services to the least skilled part of the population. That never existed, say, at 1900 when we had no income tax, very little government structure. So what that means is that when you bring in low-skill immigrants like this, or an immigrant flow that is disproportionately low-skill, they have a fiscal consequence. One way to think about this is that over the last 20 years or so, the United States has imported about 11 million high school dropouts from abroad. Now, if you were to say in any forum, well, we just had an additional 11 million high school dropouts born in, say, Kentucky or something like that, everyone would go, oh, wow, that doesn't sound very good. That sounds like a lot of cost and a lot of social problem that we're going to have to deal with as a result of those people. But if the 11 million high school dropouts come from Guatemala, somehow in our political discourse, they become the key to a high-tech future. In reality, they are very similar, very, very similar, in fact, almost identical to low-skill or high school dropouts who are born in the U.S. They are both very heavy utilizers of government services, and they don't pay very much in taxes. So we go to the next chart here. What this shows is, and this is the result of about 6 months of research that we did, this shows the typical benefits received by a low-skill immigrant household, a household that doesn't have a high school degree, and they receive about $30,000 a year in government benefits. About $10,000 of that is means-tested welfare benefits, about $5,000 is Social Security, about another $10,000 is public education, and then we have roads and highways and things like that, other services that need to expand as you add individuals into the population. Incidentally, if you were to compare this to non-immigrant high school dropouts, they look almost exactly the same. Immigrants differ only very slightly in the sense that their children tend to be somewhat more upwardly mobile, but fiscally they're about the same. Then we could compare how much these households pay in taxes. And the reality is that they pay a lot of taxes, about $10,000 a year. Very little income tax, but they pay some Social Security taxes. They pay some state property taxes. They pay sales taxes. They buy a lot of lottery tickets. So we have, in fact, every tax that is paid in this equation, about $10,000 a year. And that leads us to the general equation that each of these households then receives about $30,000 a year in benefits and services. It may seem like a whole lot, but you need to understand that the average household receives about $20,000 a year in benefits and services. So this is really only somewhat higher because of the use of means-tested welfare such as Medicaid and food stamps. And they pay about $10,000 in taxes, and that results in a net deficit of around $19,000 a year. Each household of this kind requires $19,000 more in services than they pay in taxes, and someone else has to pay for that, and that someone else is the upper middle class in the United States. An interesting thing is we tend to think of people as being net tax contributors when they're young, and then when they get older, they take out from Social Security. These are the low-skill immigrant households at every age, starting in their 20s, moving up through retirement. And what you can see is that the red line, which is expenditures and services they receive, always exceeds the taxes they pay in. This type of household is in net deficit from the minute it crosses the border into the U.S. and remains in net deficit throughout the lifetime of the household. As a result of that, what we find is that if you take all the high school dropout households in the U.S., in a typical year, they impose a net cost, that is benefits received minus taxes paid in, of around $89 billion a year. Over the course of a decade, they cost close to $1 trillion. And you could say, well, doesn't the next generation make up for that? Don't their kids do better? No, their kids do better, so their kids will not be in extreme deficit like this, but even the second generation doesn't pay enough in taxes to pay for the benefits they receive, and so over all the course of time, this is a very negative and costly type of immigrant to come into the U.S. By contrast, a college-educated immigrant will pay considerably more in taxes than they take out in services. We could say, well, aren't there economic gains that come from this that compensate for this fiscal loss? We can discuss this more, but the reality is, again, just increasing the GDP does not mean that there was a gain for the average American citizen. And when you talk about consumer gains of immigration, one of the typical arguments is to say, well, they reduce consumer prices, but somehow they don't reduce wages. If they've reduced consumer prices, then they have also reduced wages. And I think the best estimates of this show that this large influx of low-skill immigrants has reduced the wages of low-skill American workers by about 10%. And so when you hear about, well, they generate a consumer surplus, that consumer surplus only occurs because of a much larger wage loss that has occurred among the workers that are competing with this immigrant flow. Now, what should we do specifically and very briefly about reform right now? The first thing we should do is we should have no amnesty. Amnesty is manifestly unfair to people who come to the United States legally. If you look at the bill that was blocked in the Senate this summer, what that bill said was that anyone who came to the United States and was in the United States illegally on January 1st of this year gets to become a U.S. citizen. Well, you could take two individuals who were both here on temporary visas in December of 2006. The visas ran out. One of those individuals said, oh, the United States now wants me to leave, and went home. That individual will, under this legislation, never become a U.S. citizen. But the one that said, the United States wants me to leave, I don't care what the laws of the United States say, I'm staying, that's the one that we specifically select to become a U.S. citizen. You couldn't think of a more bizarre way of doing things. Again, I think if you looked across the globe, there are probably at least 2 billion people who would like to come to the U.S. and be U.S. citizens, and we should not be selecting our future citizenship primarily or exclusively on the basis that people came here and broke our laws. Second thing that we need to do is to secure the border and to secure the actual rule of law that says it is unlawful to hire illegal immigrants. If we did that, what we would find, and we do not make any attempt to do that at all at the present time, any meaningful attempt, you would find that it would be quite easy to, in fact, deter the employment of illegal immigrants, and most of them would simply go home. Not all of them, but most of them would simply go home. It also is far easier to secure the border if you actually want to do it than many people could think. And a lot of people who say you can't secure the border are ones that don't want to secure the border in the first place. With respect to legal immigration, what we need to do is we recognize the fact that we are now bringing in 1 million legal immigrants each year. This is one of the highest immigration flows we've ever had. And what we need to do is restructure that so that we're bringing in better educated immigrants, not low-skill immigrants who will be costly to the taxpayer. And fourth and finally, if in barring the employment of illegals, we create labor shortages in a small number of industries where they are concentrated, such as, say, hotel work, some types of construction, lawn care, and things like that, it is possible that we could temporarily backfill those with temporary worker programs that were not permanent and were not gifts of citizenship and rights of access to welfare and so forth. But I think far more importantly, the way to deal with that is to in fact allow American workers to take those positions. It's not true that American workers don't do this type of work. In almost every field that illegal immigrants are concentrated in, the majority of workers, or the overwhelming majority of workers, are Americans. And they would be very willing to take on most of this work, although you might have to pay them something more. And I would say, bravo. The last thing in the world we want is an immigration policy that is deliberately driving down the wages of our least skilled workers. One of the things I do in my political life is I also work on welfare as well as immigration. And so in a typical day, I will hear the following two statements. There are absolutely no Americans who are willing to take these jobs that low-skill immigrants are currently doing. And then the next conversation I will have is there are no jobs available for welfare recipients. We can't expect them to work, and so forth. And the reality is there's a little bit of truth in both of those things, but there is a large amount of low-skilled labor in the U.S. that is willing to take this work. And what has happened is that the illegal immigrants are very, very mobile and tend to move into these jobs more quickly than American workers do. But I'm down in San Antonio earlier this year with the Chamber of Commerce down there saying, well, we can't get workers to come to San Antonio even at $14 an hour, so we have to bring them in from Guatemala. Well, all across the United States, there are plenty of people who will work for $14 an hour, $12 an hour, and so forth, but they don't know about the availability of these jobs. And one of the things that would happen if we had fewer illegal low-skill immigrants is that you would generate somewhat higher wages for low-skill American workers, and you would also generate considerably more internal migration for those workers. That's part of the American dream, and we shouldn't be abandoning that part of the American dream. But to go back to my core principle, we need to have an immigration policy that is beneficial to Americans, that helps Americans meet the American dream, and one that is determined by Americans for their benefit, not determined unilaterally by those from abroad who choose to violate our laws.
Thank you, Robert. Very clear. Very much to time. Thank you. That was very good. Daniel, please. Daniel Griswold.
Thank you very much, David. And I want to compliment Wake Forest University for holding this conference and for this panel. I think you've done a good job of getting three representatives of three very distinct positions in the debate: the conservative right, the liberal left, and the sweet, reasonable center. Just kidding, guys. At the Cato Institute, we are convinced that immigration is a net positive for America, not out of some nostalgic view of immigration, but looking at the hard numbers in the American experience. Immigrants help make America a more prosperous, dynamic, and free country. And current immigration inflows are well within the norms of American experience. If you look at the immigration rate, and we think of everything else as a rate, the poverty rate, the crime rate, the unemployment rate, we're accepting about 4 legal immigrants per year per 1,000 U.S. population currently. If you go back 100 years during the Great Migration, it was over 10. In fact, from 1840 to 1920, the rate of immigration was higher than it is today during that 80-year period. And even with the inflow of immigrants, legal and illegal, our population growth rate today is the lowest it's been since the Great Depression. And our labor force is projected to continue to slow in terms of its growth for the next several decades, even with immigration. So all immigration is doing is helping us slow the decline in our population and labor force growth rate. At the high end, we heard some of that earlier this morning, immigrants help fuel the dynamism and flexibility and innovation of our economy, bringing in human capital and new ideas. 40% of PhD workers in the United States in computer and math and engineering are foreign-born. Very significant share of our high-tech startup companies are founded by immigrants. 1/3 of U.S. Nobel Prize winners in medicine and physiology were born abroad. And we have the H-1B program, as flawed as it is. By the way, think tanks are exempt from the H-1B, so the president of Cato could replace me tomorrow with an H-1B worker from Hungary, which some people would probably think would be a good thing. I think they'd enjoy it anyway. But let's talk about low-skilled immigration. And here also, immigrants are filling an important niche in the U.S. economy. And it's driven by two powerful economic and demographic forces that are attracting these low-skilled immigrants here. On the demand side, our economy continues to create hundreds of thousands of low-skilled jobs every year, net. In fact, the Labor Department projects over the next decade we're going to add about 4 million of these jobs net. We all know what they are in retail, food preparation, cleaning, light manufacturing, landscaping, mostly hired by small businesses, by the way. And at the same time, on the supply side, we're getting older and better educated. The baby boomers are aging. I can vouch for that. And we're getting better educated. Believe it or not, if you went back to the early 1960s, half of adult Americans in the workforce did not have a high school diploma. Today, it's well below 10% and dropping. The last time I checked, it's 6.6% of native-born Americans over 25 did not have a high school diploma. In fact, the number, and those are the people who've traditionally filled these low-skill, low-wage, low-status jobs. There is no army of unemployed Americans out there waiting to fill these jobs. And yet, and here's the rub, there's no legal channel in our immigration system to allow a peaceful, hardworking person from Mexico or elsewhere to come into this country and fill these jobs. If you're closely related to an American, if you have skills, a college education, there's a way to get in. But if you're just a hardworking person who knows of a job, the door is closed. And as a result, we have 12 million people here illegally. That's the best number out there. And 500,000 net typically coming in. We have tried enforcement. We have made a good stab at enforcement, and it has failed. Let me just give you some numbers. In the last 15 years, since we really started ramping up enforcement, we have increased line watch hours on the border, the actual hours, 8-fold, 8 times. Real spending has gone up 6-fold. We've built walls for miles into the desert. President Bush brags that under his watch, the spending and agents on the border will have doubled. If we were talking about any other program where we've increased spending this much, would my fiscal conservative friends be talking about just pouring more money into it? I don't think so. We've made a good stab at interior enforcement. It waxes and wanes, but in the late 1990s, we were citing and fining hundreds of companies, arresting tens of thousands of workers. It did not make a dent. They've ramped that up again. We have raids on chicken processing plants in Georgia, and Walmart came under the scrutiny of the government and was found subcontractors were hiring illegal janitors. We arrest 1,000 people one day. There's 8 million to go. Those 1,000 people that we bust, they're replaced in the next few days. So we're trying to drain a lake with a spoon. It just doesn't work. Basically, enforcement without reform is doomed to fail. It has failed in the past. I predict it'll fail in the future. Our enforcement-only efforts have had it's not like they haven't had any effect. They've had 3 perverse consequences. It's actually somebody trying to sneak across the Mexican border actually has a higher percentage chance of getting in than they did 10 or 15 years ago. The smugglers are more sophisticated. They're coming in through remote regions. The catch is they're 3 times more likely to die as well. And so deaths in the desert have gone up significantly. Over the last decade, more than 3,000 people have died. We have morgues and refrigerator trucks with bodies that are unnamed and unclaimed. It just strikes me as too high a price to pay for looking for a better job. And the irony is, once they get here, they're more likely to stay. Mexican migration to the United States has traditionally had a circular component. They come here for a few years to solve problems back home. They send money back home, and then they go back home. Mexico's their country. It's a wonderful country, and Mexicans, by and large, want to stay there and with their family and live and prosper in Mexico. What we've done by making it dangerous and expensive to cross the border is once they're in, they tend to stay. They don't want to go back and visit and then not be able to come back in or die in the desert. So as a result, the average stay of an illegal immigrant 15 years ago, 20 years ago, was about 2.5 years. Today it's over 5 years, so we've doubled the stay. 60% of illegals have been here 5 years or more. Well, I believe the only answer, and here's where we get to solutions, I believe the only answer is comprehensive immigration reform. Yes, we need to enforce the law, but the law has to be reasonable and enforceable, and this law is not. We need to change the law, and I think the crucial change, and I think this would address the issue of illegal immigration, securing our borders and helping our economy, we need to create that legal channel so that hardworking, peaceful people can come here and fill these jobs that there are just not enough Americans to fill. I think the revealed demand of our economy is perhaps 400,000 or 500,000 of these workers a year. I think we should have a temporary worker program that allows that number to come in. A lot of the opponents of this point to the 1986 law, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It really did neither, unfortunately, but they say, oh, we tried that in 1986, they're not going to fool us again. Well, there was a very important missing piece of that 1986 law. Yes, it had an amnesty by any definition. It had ramped up enforcement, but there was no provision for expanding the number of legal workers coming in the future. So we amnestied 2.7 million, and the bathtub just started filling up again. So we need to enact that missing third leg of the stool of comprehensive immigration reform so that it works. And we have an example from not too distant history. In the 1950s, we had a guest worker program, the Bracero program. It had its flaws, but we learned an important lesson from that. We had a problem of widespread illegal immigration in the early 50s. About 1 million people we were apprehending at the border each year. What Congress did, they stepped up enforcement. They called it Operation Wetback. I don't think we'd call it that again. But they also dramatically expanded the number of visas. And what happened? Illegal immigration dropped dramatically. You know, these immigrants may be low-skilled, but they're not dumb. If you give them the choice of you can come in illegally, you can pay a smuggler $2,000, you can risk your life in the desert, you can live a shadow existence here with limited employment opportunities, you can't go back and visit your family unless you want to do that all again, or you can come into the United States legally. You can apply for a temporary visa, you can cross a port of entry and enjoy the full responsibilities and protections of the law here and go back and forth freely. I believe that the large majority will take us up on that offer if we just change the incentives and give them a legal way to come in. I think they'll come in legally if we allow them to come in legally. Well, let me just address some points that both of my colleagues either have brought up or I anticipate will bring up. And to my friends on the left, I would say I don't think we need a raft of new labor laws, prevailing wage laws, and this sort of thing. I believe that the market is best able to set wages. It's kind of funny. Some of my friends on the right, their distrust of the market flares up when they're talking about immigration. They talk about these greedy businessmen who aren't going to pay people a fair wage. I think the market works, and I think our country shows it. I think the important thing is that the visas are portable. This was the flaw of the Bracero program. But if you give immigrant workers portability, the best worker protection is the ability to leave one employer and go to another. You don't like the pay and conditions, you move and go to another employer. The idea that, well, if employers just paid more, this problem would go away. Well, there are certain limits to what people can be paid. It's called marginal productivity. You can't pay a worker more than what they produce. So I heard somebody in the business community say there's only so much a small business can afford to pay before demand for their service disappears. And some of these jobs aren't that low paid. You know, they're just unpleasant, low status work, and there's simply not enough Americans lining up for it. The impact on low skilled wages, it's true. One of the best studies on immigration was done by the National Academy of Sciences about 10 years ago, and I think it's still valid. But they came to the conclusion that immigration disadvantages two groups in America, and two groups only. Other recent immigrants, which makes sense, they're like the new immigrants coming in, and Americans without a high school diploma. It's not 10%. I would disagree with Robert on that. The best studies, including the National Academy of Science, say it's 1 or 2 or 3%. There's been a recent one by the National Bureau of Economic Research that came to that conclusion as well. So basically 90+% of Americans are somewhat better off because of immigration. But the less than 10% of Americans, if you use Robert's analogy of the factory, 9 out of 10 workers are better off. There's one that isn't, and that's the one without a high school diploma. But if you're 25 years old without a high school diploma and you're trying to make your way in our high-tech economy, you're getting it from all sides. Mostly technology, trade, immigration is one of the least of your problems. In fact, just staying in school and getting your high school diploma, no education after that, but just having your high school diploma, you'll on average earn 38% more than a high school dropout. So if you care about the earnings of low-skilled Americans, what's the best advice you can give them? Just keep plugging away, we'll seal the borders and your wages will go up 2%. Or why don't you stay in school or go back and get your GED and get your 38% raise? I think education's the answer. The fiscal impact. And this is where my friend Robert hammers away. It's his area of expertise, but I politely disagree with him. One, I think we agree on the sign. I think all studies come to the conclusion that low-skilled immigrants, like low-skilled Americans, are a net drain on the government, certainly at the state and local level. There's no argument about that. But you know, immigrants don't come here to go on welfare, they come here to work. They have an amazingly high labor force participation rate. That's why they come to America, the economic opportunities here. The 1996 immigration bill had a whole title making it more difficult for immigrants to get welfare. Since then, immigration is up and welfare use of major programs is down. Other organizations and entities have looked at the cost of immigration, and while the sign tends to be negative, they come to much smaller numbers than what Robert has found for Heritage. I'll just give you 2 examples. In June 2007, the Congressional Budget Office kind of scored the immigration reform, and they found that it would actually produce a $20 billion surplus for the federal government over the next 10 years. Yes, certain welfare payments would go up, particularly the Earned Income Tax Credit, but they would also pay more in Social Security taxes and fees, and it would actually be a net plus for the federal government. The National Research Council, the National Academy of Science studies I mentioned, also looked at this, and what they found is that the typical immigrant and their descendants, because this is complicated, you can't assign to an immigrant the cost of educating their children as a cost of that immigrant without taking into account what those children pay. And Robert's right, the children of immigrants tend to do better than their parents. And you have to take into account the taxes they paid. The National Academy of Sciences looked forward multi-generations. Their children, their children, their children scored the taxes they paid, and they found that in net present value, in other words, taking those future payments and bringing it into the present, taking into account a 3% discount rate, it's an $80,000 surplus for governments at all levels of the typical immigrant. Now, the typical low-skilled immigrant, they impose a cost on the government, but if you take into account their children, it's still a net loss, but much lower. And if you take into account welfare reform, the National Academy of Science concluded that the typical low-skilled immigrant, that without a high school education, and their children, with changes in the welfare, their descendants, and with changes in the welfare law, imposes a net present value cost, bringing it into the present, of about $5,000. In other words, you could post a bond of $5,000, and the interest over the years, over the decades, you take care of the cost. It's a real cost. You let in 400,000 low-skilled immigrants and let them stay. You legalize 8 million or so. That you're getting into the tens of billions of dollars, but it's a one-time cost, and I think that's affordable. And you have to compare that. You have to hold that up to the economic gains. We can't just judge people by their impact on the government. That is important. But these immigrants are enabling important sectors of our economy to grow and meet the needs of their customers. There's a couple of state-level studies that I found particularly interesting. One right here in North Carolina, the Kennan Institute of Private Enterprise at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Sorry to mention one of your competitors. But they came to the conclusion that in North Carolina, they found that Hispanic immigrants contribute $756 million in taxes to the state each year while costing $817 million. Robert's right, it's a negative impact. But that's fairly small, $61 million a year, set against what they estimated was a $9 billion increase in economic activity in the state, some of that captured by the immigrants themselves, but also a lot of it accruing to citizens of the state. There was a more comprehensive study done by the Texas Comptroller's Office in 2006. And that came to the conclusion, looking at state and local governments, and Texas has a lot of illegal immigrants, that it costs the state and local governments there about $500 million a year. That's real money. But they also concluded that the Texas economy was $17.7 billion larger, with a significant chunk of that also accruing to non-immigrant members of the public. And there's other social costs that people have tried to ascribe to immigrants, like crime is going up. Well, in fact, the overall crime rate has gone down fairly significantly in the last 15 years at a time of heavy immigration. Lou Dobbs tries to say that leprosy is going up because immigrants are coming in, and that, of course, was disproven. I would just say this. Immigrants are not swelling the American underclass. They tend to have lower skills, but just some numbers that I've found. If you take Robert's definition of a low-skilled household, a household headed by somebody without a high school diploma, and I accept his word that they're going to consume more than they pay in taxes. I think it's much smaller than he says. But what's the trend? There are actually fewer of those households today than there were 10 years ago. In fact, the number of, and the Census Bureau publishes this, the number of Hispanic-led households that are low-skilled households has gone up by about 800,000 over the last decade. Not a huge increase. There are 800,000 more of those families headed by Hispanics. The number of households with a low-skilled head of household that is non-Hispanic has gone down by 2.4 million. So those low-skilled households are actually contracting as a share of overall households. They're becoming more Hispanic, but they're actually contracting. The poverty rate is down more than about 1.5 points in the last decade. So we're not seeing a swelling of the underclass because of low-skilled immigration. In effect, we're kind of swapping out what has been a predominantly non-Hispanic underclass for one that is still predominantly non-Hispanic, but more Hispanic. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Let me just close on something that concerns everybody, and that's border security. I believe that if we had a sensible immigration reform along the lines I'm talking about, allowing people to come in legally to fill these jobs, and I think we should have a path to legalization, not necessarily citizenship. For those who are here, we can assess fines, we can put them on probation, which is what you typically do for a misdemeanor, which is what they've committed. But I think if you have an orderly way for them to enter legally, you'll create order at the border, where we now have chaos. Reform would transform enforcement. It would begin to drain the swamp of smuggling and document fraud. We'd encourage millions of people to come forward and cooperate with law enforcement. I think Professor Taylor this morning made a very good point along that way. And important on the fiscal front, we would free up resources to go after real criminals and terrorists. I had the privilege in this immigration reform debate of sitting in some meetings with Homeland Security Chertoff and a bunch of other people. It wasn't like it was a private meeting with me. But he made the point eloquently and often that regularizing, legalizing the inflow of these low-skilled immigrants through a temporary worker program would make his job more manageable. And here's a quote he said, it's not a very long one. "This regulated channel for temporary workers would dramatically reduce the pressure on our borders, aid our economy, and ease the task of our law enforcement agents inside the country. There is an inextricable link between the creation of a temporary worker program and better enforcement at the border." Just ask yourself this. What in the world is our Homeland Security Department using its precious resources going after janitors and dishwashers and landscapers when they should be going after real criminals and terrorists? I'll just end on this note. I'm not for legal immigration. I'm for the rule of law. But the law has to be reasonable. And we have had precedents in our country where we've changed bad laws. You know, Prohibition in the 1930s made criminals out of millions of people who just wanted to have a drink after dinner. And instead of doubling enforcement and going after those lawbreakers, we changed the law. There's a wonderful book by Hernando de Soto called The Mystery of Capital, which is basically a book about property rights. And he spends a whole chapter in that book about how the American frontier was settled. And did you know our frontier was settled by basically illegal squatters, who they called extra legals? They went out there, they started their farm, even though they didn't technically have ownership rights to the land. We faced a choice then too. We could send in the National Guard and clear them off and enforce the law. No, we changed the law. That's partly what the Homestead Act was about. And De Soto came to this conclusion, and I'll just end with this. He said, the law must be compatible with how people actually arrange their lives. I think that's the challenge before us today. Thank you.
And our third speaker is Ross Eisenbrey. Ross.
Good morning, everybody. I am Ross Eisenbrey from the Economic Policy Institute, and you heard one of our founding board members that gave the opening address, Ray Marshall. And I agree with most of what Ray Marshall had to say to you, and I find myself agreeing with a lot of what both Robert Rector and Dan Griswold have said, although obviously a little from each of them. Let's start with the rule of law. I think we all agree that it's important, and the rule of law works when the law is transparent and understandable, and when it accords with economic realities and the way people live their lives, as Dan just said. And as you heard from Professor Taylor, the law that we have now is disastrously confused, complex, badly administered, and most importantly, it isn't respected. Every day, millions, well, hundreds of thousands certainly, of employers across the country are violating the law. They're employing people who they know or certainly strongly suspect are not authorized to work here. And so the problem is not just a problem of the hardworking people who have crossed the border looking for a job having violated our law. It's a problem of, as Ray Marshall would say, it's a problem of Congress, which has known this problem is there for decades and really hasn't done anything to address it. It's all of these businesses. It's homeowners who are not business people but who hire gardeners and nannies, and it's a pervasive problem that's shared. And so the solution, a fair solution, probably isn't to take it out on these solely on the people who have crossed the border and come here, and to say all of the problem of illegality is theirs. They'll bear the burden, and we'll all take the consequences, which have been estimated to be on the order of a couple of $100 billion, the cost of deporting all of these people. But I do agree that unauthorized or illegal immigration is a problem. Okay, so why is it a problem? It undermines the rule of law. It hurts low-skilled U.S. workers. I think we all agree that that's the case. The numbers are very much in contention. The leading paper on this by a Harvard researcher, George Borjas, started off saying that 14% of the loss of wages of less than high school educated people in the United States, 8% of the 14% loss they've experienced over 2 decades was caused by the immigration of low-skilled immigrants. His co-author has subsequently disagreed with that and has lowered his own estimate a couple of times down to, I think, to about 2% of that 14% was caused by immigration. And I think Borjas most recently is saying something on the order of 4%. So it's in contention. The direction is clear. There is harm done to low-skilled native workers, but as Dan said, that's a shrinking pool, and they have lots of problems that they would have even without immigration. Is there a fiscal burden? Like Dan, I'm very skeptical of the numbers that you've heard this morning. But even if you assume that those numbers were right and that there's an $89 billion net cost, there is another wage effect of all of these immigrants, and there's some very interesting work that's been done by Giovanni Perry and others calculating, and David Card, calculating that there's a net positive effect on all American workers' wages. So that even though at the lower end, the approximately 10% of the workforce that's less than high school educated is suffering wage depression, there's a lifting of wages for everybody else, and since there are 9 times as many of the more skilled workers and their wages are higher, the net effect is on the order of $100 billion a year. If you accept their number, that overall there's about a 1.8% lifting of average wages for everyone else from the low-skilled immigrants, then the net effect is greater than this fiscal burden. The positive effect on all American workers is greater than the fiscal burden that Robert Rector has presented to you today. But it is also it's damaging to have 10 to 20 million people living in the United States who live in fear and in danger, and whose wages, their own wages, are depressed by the effect of being here without authorization. There are estimates that the simple act of being authorized raises an individual's wages between 20 and 40%. So on the very important issue of amnesty, I can't disagree more with Robert Rector that this is a plus from every point of view, making these people who share in the whole society's failure with respect to our immigration policy, making them legal would have tremendous benefits politically. It would have tremendous benefits economically, and I think it needs to be done. How we go about doing that is something I'll talk about later. We're having trouble getting Congress to approve that in one great bite. Maybe we can get Congress to do it in sort of a pilot program kind of way. So agreeing with Dan that immigration is a net benefit to the economy, and wanting to have a way that this happens in the future that doesn't involve illegality, I disagree completely that the solution is guest workers. In a sense, it reproduces the problem of having people here who are good enough to work here, but not good enough. We don't think they're good enough to stay here. They're not good enough to be made citizens eventually. We want their work, and then we want them to leave. I think that's a very bad approach for any society. And the experience that we've had with guest worker programs is pretty bad. The Bracero program itself had ups and downs. It's true, at some points the Bracero program did control, seemed to control illegal immigration, at least measured by apprehensions, but for one period from 1942 to 1946, there were 4 million people admitted as braceros and 5.2 million unauthorized apprehensions, and the estimates are that there were 3 times as many people who made it through the net and weren't apprehended. So it's also, I think everybody who has studied this agrees that the Bracero program was the gateway to the immigration problem that we have now from Mexico, that it created the experience, it created the networks that now make it easy for people to come in and partly assimilate from Mexico, and it also created the expectation in Mexico that one could make it to the United States and work and then eventually stay, because many braceros did end up staying in the United States. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is clearly to increase the number of employment visas and make it possible for people to come with a green card, come to the United States. They don't need to stay. Having a green card doesn't mean you have to stay, so that the circular migration that Dan talked about, people who would come and go across the border, return home, having worked in the United States, would be possible with green cards, but it would create a status for them that would be much better than the status of a guest worker who can be here only a certain time and then is forced to leave. So what is the experience that we've had with other guest worker programs? The Bracero program was the biggest, but we've had continuing guest worker programs in agriculture and in forestry and hotels, out in occupations outside of agriculture that are pretty dismal. A report that we published at the Economic Policy Institute, republished by the Southern Poverty Law Center, looks at a very in-depth series of interviews with thousands of H-2 workers and documents a list of abuses that's really quite appalling in terms of vicious recruiting practices. Employers who depend on them hire brokers who go to Guatemala and Central America and other places in Latin America and recruit workers to come to the United States on false promises of wages and having housing, and they get here and find themselves sleeping in fields, living in shacks, living in unsafe housing. Their pay is much lower than promised, sometimes less than the minimum wage. There's virtually no enforcement by the federal government or any state government on the pay of these workers. They're paid on a piece rate that no matter how hard they work, sometimes doesn't get them to the minimum wage, let alone to the wage that was initially promised or the prevailing wage that's required by law. And they work in appalling conditions with high rates of injury and no access to, they're often in rural areas where they have little access to health care, but in any event they can't pay for it because they either aren't covered by workers' compensation or don't know that they're covered by workers' compensation, and they're often hurt, and because they can't work, they're then fired and deported, because if they're not working, they're not allowed to be here, and so they're deported and have no way to access our judicial system from their homes in Central America. So the H-2B program, I commend this report to you. It's called Close to Slavery by Mary Bauer of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It will give you an idea of what can go wrong with guest worker programs. The other program, the H-2A program, for agricultural, non-immigrant, temporary agricultural workers brings in 30 to 50,000 workers a year who are guaranteed housing and sometimes get it, but there's very little enforcement there. It has a history of problems that have often been appalling, as soon as workers contest their conditions, as soon as they contest the fact that they're not being paid the promised wages, they are fired and once again are deported, and they have no right to sue in our courts under current law. So when Dan says we don't need legal protections, we don't need prevailing wages or new enforcement techniques for the guest workers, I think the history of these programs would say clearly otherwise, that they need legal rights to bring suit in the United States. They need a Department of Labor that will enforce the law. We have 50% the number of wage and hour inspectors that we had in 1980 working for the federal government, yet the population has grown by, Dan might know the number offhand, 50 or 60%. So we don't have a governmental enforcement effort that meets the needs for native workers, let alone for these guest workers. So what needs to be done? We do need an employment visa system that will permit something like the flow that Dan is talking about. If there is a market need, if the market can't find the low-skilled workers or any other kind of worker that it needs within our borders, if their shortages can really be shown, then we should have employment visas enough to bring people in a regular flow from Mexico and the rest of the world. What do we do about those 10 to 20 million people who are here? I say we should have amnesty, but going forward, it's true, that kind of an amnesty will tell the rest of the world you can go to the United States illegally and expect to be amnestied at some point. So we do need a change in how employers are dealt with, because the magnet here, there's a push from Mexico. Yes, their economy is bad and people are looking for work, but if there weren't also a magnet here of employers drawing them, seeking them, and accepting those workers, we wouldn't have the employment flow of illegals that we have today. So we do need a secure work authorization program and some kind of enforcement to make it work. What we have today was constructed as a farce. I was actually at the table as a staff person in Congress in 1986 when the compromise in the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. Everybody at the table understood that without a secure national identifier, a national ID card, something that the government would control, we would not have a system that worked. You can't rely on employers to verify somebody's ability to work. It's not in their interest or their ability to do it. They want the worker who's there before them. They have really no interest in denying that person the job. So what you need is a system where the federal government, the employer's only responsibility is to ask the federal government, does this individual have authority to work, and then relies on the federal government to do it. And then the federal government's responsibility is to make sure that everyone here who's an authorized worker has an identity card, a number that's verifiable, and a secure system to keep it from being cheated on by illegal aliens. So how do we get to an amnesty? We haven't managed it yet. We've had a debate in Congress that failed, but there is a model that I think can be tried, and if it's shown to work, maybe it'll give the Congress the kind of encouragement it needs to go forward and take the next step. There's legislation called the Agricultural Job Opportunities, Benefits, and Security Act, or AgJobs, that I think ought to be enacted. It has these these attributes. It provides for earned legalization. Farm workers can be given legal status. And why farm workers? Well, we have about 1 million farm workers who are here without authorization by some estimates, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million. In a part of the economy where nobody denies that there are labor shortages. So whatever the principles that you've heard here, I think all of us would agree that this is an area where there actually is a labor shortage, and we need to do something different and dramatic to make sure that farmers and the agriculture industry here has the workers it needs. So they can be given legal status if they've worked half a year in agriculture for the past 2 years, didn't commit any crime after entry, and pay a fine. If they do that, they get a blue card, which means that they're here legally. They can now unionize if they wanted to without fear of deportation, take action on their own to help raise their own wages. But at that point, they can stop living in fear of being deported. They can earn permanent resident status by working an additional 150 days a year in agriculture for 3 to 5 years, pay a larger fine, keep a clean criminal record, i.e. with no felonies or serious misdemeanors. After that time, having established that attachment to agriculture, they would earn permanent status in the United States. They would derive derivative status for their spouse and children who are already in the United States but not for family members back home. And as part of this compromise, there would be a temporary changes to the current temporary foreign worker program, the H-2 program that I talked about, to make it easier for employers to make use of it, but also give employees the right to enforce, the foreign workers who are part of this temporary program, the right to enforce their rights in federal court. So why does this make sense? It has majority support in both the House and the Senate. It had 30 Senate co-sponsors, including 8 Republicans. It makes sense because business and labor and workers advocates and immigration advocates have been working on this for decades and have finally worked out a compromise that everybody in that industry agrees is essential for their health going forward. So if this were enacted and if there were amnesty for these 600,000 to 1 million people, we would have a pilot case. We would see how hard it was for the INS with all of its problems or Homeland Security to deal with the authorization process. We would be able to test what happened to wages in this industry from authorization to see the benefits of it. We'd be able to test the welfare costs that Robert Rector has been talking about. It actually would be a wonderful social experiment, and I think with presidential support, even from President Bush, if he pushed hard enough, this could be done in this Congress. This reform could be enacted. Let me just, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Let me just say a word about high-tech visas and the other end of the immigration spectrum. The best test any economist will tell you for a shortage is that the price of whatever it is in short supply goes up. And we often hear that there's a tremendous shortage of workers in high-tech industries, engineering, computer sciences, and so forth, and that this is why we need a greatly expanded temporary worker program to bring workers from abroad. One of the best economists in America, Richard Freeman, wrote this wonderful book called America Works, which I recommend to everybody, and relates what happened in the United States when, instead of resorting to outside supply, we decided to, as a government, to do something about the internal supply. This is one of the only places in the economy where economists forget that the market works. If you raise the price of something, in this case, if you raise the rewards for going into science and engineering, you'll get more people in the United States doing it. It's not that, all of you out there don't have the ability, but the rewards often aren't sufficient to draw people in. So he presents two pieces of evidence about what could be done to greatly increase the supply. National Science Fellowships in 1999 were increased for graduate students in the sciences from $15,000 to $30,000. The effect was immediate. The number of students who applied for the stipend doubled in 1 year. The applicants had superb applications, superb qualifications, and higher GRE scores than the people who had been applying up to that point, better letters of recommendation, and so on. So the simple market solution of the government saying, instead of reaching overseas, we'll develop our own homegrown talent, paid an immediate reward. His other example is a survey of Harvard students, graduate students who are not in the sciences, asking them how would they respond if there were a $20,000 stipend for them to switch to a science or math fellowship or graduate study. And 14% said that they would make the switch. 40% said they would make the switch if the stipend were at $40,000 a year. So you can see what the market could do if we really had shortages, if industry were really interested in paying for it. They would raise their own wages for these jobs. They would support increases in the pipeline here in the United States through stipends and subsidies to students to help them make that choice. One last personal anecdote about this. I know students who have graduated recently with engineering degrees. They did not go into engineering. They went to Wall Street, where the rewards were so much greater for their skills that it makes you, it just reinforces for me that if there really is a shortage, companies like Boeing and the great engineering firms here will pay to meet it, unless they're given the safety valve of reaching overseas and getting temporary workers from other countries. Thank you.